Like all nations, Kenya has been founded on the efforts of many people, institutions, organizations, professions, and corporations. One of the foundations upon which the nation has been built is the medical profession and the institutions through which that profession is practiced. Among the most famous of those institutions is the Nairobi Hospital, which on July 10, 2012, officially opened a 60-bed oncology and cancer treatment center, the largest in the East and Central African region. It is the second cancer center in the region to offer brachytherapy treatment, a process which involves a concise administration of high radiation doses to cancer tumors, whilst avoiding radiation exposure to the surrounding healthy tissues. This important medical first has changed the landscape of cancer treatment in the region, where until now, many cancer patients have had to travel overseas for the treatment.
Excellency the President now unveiled.
While opening the new cancer center, President Mwai Kibaki paid tribute to the Nairobi Hospital for the great service it has provided Kenyans all these years.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to join you for the official opening of this ultra-modern oncology and cancer treatment center. I commend the board and management of the Nairobi Hospital for providing the necessary leadership to bring this project to fruition. This facility will provide much-needed cancer treatment to many Kenyans and people beyond our borders. I wish once again congratulate the entire Nairobi Hospital fraternity on the opening of this world-class center and thank them for their many years of service to the people of Kenya and the world at large.
The origins of the Nairobi Hospital can be traced back to the colonial scramble for Africa of the 1880s, when Britain acquired British East Africa, which then comprised present-day Uganda and Kenya. The British government allowed a commercial company, Imperial British East African Company, IBEAC, under the leadership of Sir William Mackinnon, to administer and develop the territory. In 1895, the British government declared a protectorate over British East Africa, which they called the East African Protectorate. It had its capital in Mombasa. The following year, the protectorate would start building a railway line from Mombasa to Kisumu to link Kenya and Uganda. The railway, built with labour from India, reached Nairobi in 1899 and soon gave rise to a full-grown town there, with a sizable European population, most of whom worked for the colonial government. As more people settled in Nairobi, health conditions deteriorated. The first serious consequence of this deterioration was a breakout of the plague in 1902, which affected 69 people and ended up killing 19 of them. The government tried to cope with the challenge by providing medical services through government facilities. It built the first medical facility in Nairobi in 1901, which it called the Native Civil Hospital. It was located at the junction of Government and Kingsway Roads, or present-day Moi Avenue and University Way, and served Africans. By the end of 1902, the government had built a second hospital in Nairobi to cater for Europeans. The Nairobi European Hospital served mostly government officials. It was not a very busy hospital. In 1905, it admitted 33 patients and registered only 4 deaths. In 1907, the East Africa Protectorate moved its capital to Nairobi. Soon thereafter, a permanent spacious structure for the Nairobi European Hospital was built where present-day State House Girls' School stands. It was opened in 1908 by the colonial governor J. Hayes Sadler. The new hospital was big enough to admit nearly 80 patients, many of them suffering from malaria, typhoid, enteric fever and dysentery. By 1913, the number of patients seeking hospital services had risen to 10 per day. The end of the First World War saw more white people, especially from South Africa, settle in Kenya, many of them having been granted farmland by the government in the so-called Kenyan highlands. Since there were no other hospitals inland, the growing population of civilian European settlers and government officers depended on the Nairobi European Hospital for most of their health service needs. This, despite the fact that by 1924, the number of doctors working at the hospital at their disposal was only 7, and the number of beds was less than 20. It was at the Nairobi European Hospital that Sir Robert Corridon, governor of Uganda and southern Rhodesia, was admitted that year suffering from acute hemorrhagic pancreatitis, from which he died. One facility the Nairobi European Hospital did not have was a maternity wing. A famous nursing home that provided maternity services was the 31-bed Maya Carbury nursing home, which was opened by Lady Macmillan in 1929. The Maya Carbury nursing home was named after Maya Ivory Anderson Carbury, a woman pilot who was the first person to fly non-stop from Mombasa to Nairobi.
Maya was the youngest in the family of 4 boys, younger than the sister Maya. She was born in 1904. A very attractive girl, but she went over to school in Belgium, where her mother came from, and at the same convent that her mother had been at. And then when the First World War broke out, the eldest brother, Gerald, who was training to be a doctor and doing his medical training in England, went over to Belgium to get her out quickly from the war there, and brought her over to England, and then they eventually got her back to Kenya. Then when she grew up, she married John Carbury, very young, and John Carbury was already a pilot and had his own little plane, and when he took her over to England, she decided she wanted to learn to fly as well. So when she was over there, she took flying lessons in England and got her pilot's license in England, and he bought her a small plane, a small Moth it was called, and had it shipped back out to Mombasa. When it arrived, she went down to Mombasa to unpack her plane and put it all together, and then pushed it out to the sports field there and took off. Took off for Nairobi. And that was the first non-stop flight from Mombasa to Nairobi, by anybody, yes, which was an amazing feat. Then about a year after that, she was teaching a couple of young men here who were the Cowies, Mervyn Cowie and his younger brother, Dudley. And out at the little aerodrome there, which was actually, I think it was towards Dagoretti more, she was teaching them to fly. That day she'd taken up Mervyn, and then after him she took up the brother Dudley with his younger brother, and unfortunately something went wrong and they crashed, were both killed. So the family and friends in Nairobi raised money to build a hospital. It was a nursing home, which then became the Maya Carbury Nursing Home in her memory.
Her brother, Dr. Rudolf Anderson, became chairman of the Maya Carbury Nursing Home. The building of the nursing home came as the government expanded health services in the city. Soon after the 1939 to 1945 Second World War, the government built the 600-bed King George VI Hospital for the African population. The hospital had a large wing for Asians, known as the Rahimtula Wing. As had been the case with the First World War, the end of the Second World War resulted in a flood of white immigrants into Kenya, creating even greater pressure for expansion of the Nairobi European Hospital in particular, and general healthcare services for Europeans in Kenya in general. That pressure led to the formation in 1950 of the Kenya European Hospital Association, which was charged with the responsibility of overseeing improvement of the provision of healthcare for Europeans by the government. The first chairman of the Kenya European Hospital Association was Meyer Carbury's brother, Rudolf Anderson. He was not only a well-known doctor, but was also president of the Nairobi Chamber of Commerce and sat on a number of company boards of directors, including that of the East African Standard Newspaper Limited. He was one of the people behind the establishment of the Princess Elizabeth Hospital next to the Nairobi European Hospital. The Princess Elizabeth Hospital was eventually moved near the Meyer Carbury Nursing Home, where the University of Nairobi Dental School stands today. And in 1952, Dr. Anderson was among the people who organized the purchase of a polo ground upon which Nairobi European Hospital, that would later be named the Nairobi Hospital, would be built.
I don't remember details very much, but when we first started, the building was there, then we had to furnish it, and the surgeons, there were about 10 surgeons at that time, and we all put in £100, which was quite a lot of money then, and to buy a set of instruments for Nairobi Hospital, for the 2 theatres there. And the person dealing with that was Rudolf Anderson. He was one of 3 brothers. One of his brothers was Gerald Anderson, who was a distinguished surgeon, and he helped to run the Meyer Carbury nursing home. The 3rd brother was editor of the Standard, so they were quite a group.
In March 1956, the Nairobi Hospital opened the first privately owned nursing school in Kenya, the Sicily Mcdonald Nursing School. The school, which started with an intake of 5 students, was named after Sister Cicely Mcdonald, who had worked as the nurse in charge of the maternity section of the Meyer Carbury nursing home.
I'm glad to say that I attended the opening of the nursing school. My wife was trained there, and eventually ended up in Gertrude's Garden as matron. When we got married, we decided Nairobi Hospital was not big enough for both of us, so she moved out to the country. And I like to think I played a part in the training of nurses, because I did quite a lot of lecturing to them, which doctors were expected to do.
Cicely Mcdonald School of Nursing had become the epitome of nursing professional in Kenya. It has run the KRN program, which gives us the cutting edge because it's bedside oriented, consistently from 1956. The rest of the country was running an enrolled program, government or mission. And the missions came to do nursing in Kenya because they saw an outlet of preaching. So they come as missionaries, they preach, they use girls of young age, probably from even poor background, but spread the gospel in that way. So it was like an apprenticeship. And for a long time it was that, before it was then under the Nursing Council. Nairobi Hospital didn't open its doors without nurses who were local. They all were imported from England. They were called the Sunshine Nurses, and they continued until the first lot of students qualified. They started in small numbers, 5 of them at one time. The numbers grew. The idea was so that it can feed the hospital with nurses. And because it could not, for a long time the Sunshine Nurses came from Britain and looked after patients here, because also it was a European hospital.
In 1957, a new wing of the hospital, the Salisbury Wing, partly funded by a contribution of 30,000 sterling pounds from the Soresby family, was opened. The 1950s were also the years of the Mau Mau struggle for Kenya's independence, a struggle that pitted the majority of Africans against the British government and most of the white settlers in the country. With the end of the Mau Mau struggle and the growing role of African leaders in the affairs of the country came political change. Jomo Kenyatta and other leaders who had been detained during the Mau Mau struggle were set free. More Africans were elected to the Legislative Council. Independence was in sight. Looming independence put pressure on the European community in Kenya to adapt to the changing political circumstances. Some Europeans did, but many were unable or unwilling to adapt and chose to leave the country. The British government made it easy for them by arranging to buy their farms. The exodus of Europeans from Kenya and the persistence of the Kenya-European Hospital Association in treating only Europeans soon led to fewer admissions at the Nairobi Hospital, and in due course to financial problems for the association. By June 1961, the association's 3 medical institutions, the Nairobi Hospital, the Princess Elizabeth Hospital and the Maya Carbury Nursing Home were facing the threat of closure due to a shortage of nurses. The contracts of 54 of the 164 nursing staff of the association were due to come to an end in December, and most of the nurses had decided not to renew them. Their departure would force the Sicily Mcdonald School of Nursing to admit its first African students in March 1962. By that time, the association had sold Maya Carbury Nursing Home to a private concern for 40,000 sterling pounds and Princess Elizabeth Hospital to the government. Thereafter, it would concentrate its efforts on the main Nairobi Hospital.